the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, Slop the Presses. They've turned porcine and are rampaging through the streets of Laredo. Buttes and loot in zoot space suits.
Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel.
And I'm Editorial Assistant Christopher Rocchio.
Hey, we have a conversation with J.P. Sullivan this time. John is the winner of the 2017 Baen Fantasy Adventure Award, which we give out each year at Gencon in Indianapolis. We gave that out a couple of weeks ago. Actually, it was last week. Our editor, Jim Menz, was there, and he handed it out. John's story is called The Blue Widow, and it will be up on the Baen website in September. It's a great story of monster hunting in a sort of muskets and magic steampunk world that John worked out very nicely, and the heroine is fairly badass too. We'll talk about that with J.P. Sullivan.
And, of course, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of the Liaden Universe novel Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Now, here's the news. There are new e-arcs at the Baen eBooks website. E-arcs are those planetary electromagnetic jazz hands that the Earth makes towards the universe at large to protect us all from cosmic indie bands and hip-hop artists who really need to concentrate less on the bling and more on the sing. No, that's not right. Tony, what's an e-arc?
Well, let me tell you, an e-arc is an electronic advanced reading copy. These are the books that we're going to put out in 2 or 3 months. Usually it's about a 3-month lead. So you get them early, and you get them with all the typos in there, so you get plenty of spice as well that you wouldn't get in the normal print book. So it's really a great value. Anyway, if you want to get a book early, especially in your favorite series or something that you just can't wait to get and read, we put these up on the Baen eBooks site, and you can download them there and read them before they're actually even books. What we have out now is Down and Out in Purgatory by Tim Powers, the collected stories of Tim Powers. I'm really excited about this book and the fact that we're bringing out a new Tim Powers novel, an all-new Tim Powers novel next summer. But this is going to be all of the short stories that Tim ever wrote collected in one spot. And I consider this guy a modern master of science fiction and fantasy. You'll find 20 pulse-pounding, mind-bending tales of science fiction here. Twisted metaphysics, supernatural wonder. Tim has won 2 World Fantasy Awards, 2 Philip K. Dick Awards. He's the author of The Anubis Gates and On Stranger Tides, which the Pirates of the Caribbean movie was based on. That one.
The fourth one. A complete palette of short story telling colors from Powers, including The Bible Repairman, which is maybe my favorite Powers short story, where this psychic handyman supernaturally eliminates troublesome passages of the Bible for paying clients with he sort of wipes them out, and so they don't apply to the clients anymore. But it doesn't really work like that in the end. It's just a great, weird, surrealistic, cool story that Tim both makes into a magic realism sort of tale, but then makes into a really compelling, like straight up adventure story as well. That's the thing that he's really good at, is that every one of his stories has a really strong beginning, middle, and end, and it's a lot of fun just to read as a story. And plus, it's got all this weird ass stuff in it as well. Just lots of great stuff. Tim Powers is one of the great writers of our time. Argues none other than me in the introduction to this thing. So get that e-arc. Also out in e-arc form is a new standalone Dave Drake novel. This one looks great. Dave characterized it as something like a young king Arthur in the far future. This one is called The Spark. Tell us a little bit more about it, Christopher. Yeah, sure. In the time of the ancients, the universe was united, but that was so far in the past that not even memory remains, only the broken artifacts. Now a leader has arisen. In his capital of Dun-Ad, the leader provides law and justice.
In the universe beyond, his champions advance and enforce the return of civilization. Pal, a youth from the sticks, has come to Dun Ad to become a champion. Pal has no idea what he's really getting into in Dun Ad. On the other hand, the leader and Dun Ad have no real idea of what might be inside this hayseed with high hopes, for he has the spark of the makers within.
The Spark E-Arc by David Drake and Down and Out in Purgatory, the collected stories of Tim Powers are now available at BaenEbooks.com. Get them while they're hot off the old e-presses. I want to welcome J.P. Sullivan to the podcast. Hello, John.
It's great to be here.
J.P. Sullivan, John Sullivan's writing name, is the winner of the 2017 Baen Fantasy Adventure Short Story Award, given out at fabulous Gencon. We've had some fantastic stories over the past few years, but I have to say this is probably my favorite, one of my favorites, if not my favorite so far that we've seen in the contest. The story is called The Blue Widow, and it will appear at the Baen.com website on September 15th. It'll be available thereafter online, which I know a lot of our listeners will be listening to this after the fact, and will also become part of the Baen Free Library, free ebook download, Free Short Stories 2017, that's called. And you can get it at Baen eBooks in perpetuity as well. So I should probably say a few words about the Baen Fantasy Adventure Award. Here's how we put it to prospective writers in our when we open up the contest every year. We're looking for blood-pounding, heart-stopping action with heroes you want to root for and villains you love to hate. Whether your heroes win the day with swords or sorcery, fireballs or flamethrowers, or even their wits alone, all are welcome. Modern, medieval, and otherworldly settings are all acceptable as long as you can tell a rip-roaring good tale with a fantastical element, which John's story, The Blue Widow, certainly accomplished in spades. In fact, I think you got all of those elements in somewhere or another in the story, John.
No flamethrowers.
No flamethrowers. Well, there's you had a technological component as well too. It was kind of a, well, we'll talk about the world a little bit in a moment, but tell us a bit about your background. I think you've had stories out there, including in Galaxy's Edge and elsewhere.
Yeah, I was in the July issue over at Galaxy's Edge, which I think might still be up on their website. And this month I'm also featured as the cover story in Orson Scott Card's Intergalactic Medicine Show with sort of a dark fantasy thriller that I'm pretty happy to have out there. It's got a great illustration by Dean Spencer, who I think actually did some work for you guys at Baen in the past, back when you still had Baen's Universe. And I wrote both of those stories at the Clarion Writers Workshop, which I attended last year. And The Blue Widow was actually the first story I wrote after the workshop ended. So I think attending definitely helped me get my work to
cool.
a higher level of quality. And as for me more generally, I used to work in television at a pretty low level, admittedly, not like an agent or a movie star or anything, just kind of an office guy over on a few different TV shows. I didn't like that very much, and I'm in a master's degree program these days looking to change careers.
Well, maybe it'll be writing. I'm a Clarion West graduate from long, long ago, by the way. Who was your what was your lineup at Clarion?
We had a great lineup. We had Ellen Datnow did a guest lecture. Ellen Kushner of Swords Point fame was one of our instructors, along with Delia Sherman. We had Ted Chang, Victor LaVale, and Kelly Link, as well as the inimitable Andy Duncan.
Mm-hmm. Cool. There's something about those workshops, that intensity of doing 6 weeks, and it is still 6 weeks, right?
Yeah, it's still 6 weeks. You have to crank out a story every week, and in addition to critiquing a story from 15 other students every week. So it really, there's something about ratcheting up the speed that makes you kind of learn the nuts and bolts of story construction, I think, in a way that you don't. Well, because, the natural instinct of a lot of writers, myself included, is to sort of take weeks, months, if not years, to polish everything, try and get the prose perfect. I heard that when Harlan Ellison taught Clarion, he made everybody in his week write a story every day to just try and get people to focus on structure more.
Yeah. Well, there was my Clarion West. We had we had Scott Card, Karen Fowler, Lucius Shepard, who became a mentor and friend to me, and Rogers Delasney, and it was just an amazing experience for me. Who else? Connie Willis was there also, and it was it really like compressed maybe 2 or 3 years of development into that one 6-week period, which was great, especially when you're a 25-year-old, which is when I did it. So, well, let's talk more about the Blue Widow, which has you wrote it right after Clarion, so you were in a strange state of mind, no doubt. It has a very evocative and strange setting. I love the idea of the buttes above the mist in your country of Molovia. Tell us a bit how the story developed and where the idea came from and such.
The story's kind of like a product of several different ideas coming together after percolating for a long period of time. As far as the buttes goes, like I kind of had this notion in the back of my head for a while about a country where nobody could leave home for most of the year, kind of a really claustrophobic country where everybody's penned in by storms. But I didn't like the idea of everybody living underground, and floating islands felt a little too high fantasy for the tone that I was going for. So I kind of came up with this concept of an archipelago of mesas and buttes where everybody lives in tiny self-sufficient communities, but they can't actually travel between them except for a couple of months of the year when the storm breaks. But for the longest time, I had no idea what I wanted to do with that setting. And a friend of mine told me that I ought to try writing a story about a monster hunter, which got me thinking about what kind of monsters they'd be hunting and what kind of technology they'd have to do it. And I sort of laid the various pieces together. You mentioned the technology. I kind of went for an early industrial revolution, like a 19th century feel in one of those worlds that, has swords and sorcery in it, but is kind of entering a more modern era just barely.
Yeah, there's a train, but there's no guns, right? I don't think. Well, she doesn't use one.
She doesn't use one. Guns don't really figure into the story. If I were to write more stories in the setting, there might be like flintlock guns, but it's kind of an asymmetrical technological development where they got trains, but they don't have, rifles and 6-shooters going around.
Yeah, and you have your main character Teresa is a member of this monster hunting order. And she carries a magic sword, a special sword. Tell us about her a little bit, and what when we meet her, she's quite badass, but she's got a bit of a past that is slowly revealed in the story.
So in the world where the story takes place, there's a problem with monsters hiding among the human population, kind of in human form, and very few people can manage to defeat these monsters, even when they're revealed in a straight fight. But the church is pretty powerful in this setting and holds a bunch of ancient relics and magic weapons that grant people the strength to kill monsters, but the weapons are really temperamental and sort of have a mind of their own. They won't agree to be wielded by just anyone. So Teresa had just left her home as a widow after the death of her husband, and she decides that the best future for her is to join the church as a nun, but that doesn't pan out because one of the magic weapons decides that she would be a perfect candidate to wield it. So from this kind of accidental beginning, she becomes an experienced monster hunting professional, and by the time the story starts, she's very experienced, veteran, kind of approaches her job with like an irreverent results over rules approach that gets her in trouble with the order. And the job she gets in the story is kind of almost a punishment for being too much of a maverick, and the job ends up being a lot more personal than she expects, and ties into her backstory, which I won't give too much away.
Yeah, we don't want to spoil it, but the main punishment she's getting here from her superior is that she's been avoiding going back home for years now. She doesn't want to go back to her hometown, and this place, Malovia, is her home, right? So she gets to...
Yeah, she kind of fancies herself now the city sophisticate, and she's kind of from the sticks. And when in your world the sticks are also an incredibly spooky, claustrophobic, weird place where everybody dislikes you for reasons not immediately apparent. She's reluctant to go back, but she's forced to confront her history in the story.
Well, aside from the buttes sticking out above Deadly Mist, it sounds like a lot of hometowns to me, actually. So, but you're right. The story's told in this really cool acerbic style that really flows. It's dialogue driven, and you have a real dry wit with it. And I don't know if you have any influences there, or if it's just the way that you wanted to tell the story. But were you planning on it being humorous, or did it just sort of develop that way? Because it's not. I mean, it's obviously not a humorous story. It's deadly serious, but there's a lot of dry wit in there.
I'm definitely conscious of trying to use dry humor and what you call acerbic wit, even in a more serious story. First, because it's my preference in humor style, but also I think because people kind of use humor in grim situations to diffuse tension. I mean, we hear sometimes about the gallows humor of people like EMTs and how that's a coping strategy for them. And I also think humor is useful in more serious fiction because it provides a variety of tone. I think sometimes in the post-Sopranos, post-Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones media environment, we have a lot of fiction and work that focuses a little too much on dark and edgy and forgets that you can use humor and dashes of levity to provide a contrast that lets you appreciate how serious the circumstances are more. And I think I don't know about I guess one influence in fantasy fiction, I think KJ Parker, or Tom Holt, if you prefer to use his recently revealed real name, does that really well in his short fiction. There's a lot of grim stuff going on in the KJ Parker universe, but there's all these little jokes that kind of jump out and provide these moments of relief that I think do good things for pacing.
There's a lot of imagination in the story as well. Can you explain these damn butterflies that are like the souls of people that we see? That's a kind of a monster that shows up.
Yeah. That one's a little weirder than some of the other stuff in the story. Not explained super in depth. I kind of left the mechanics of that vague on purpose. Brandon Sanderson has talked a few times at length, I think pretty well, about the difference between, using rules-based magic where we understand everything very well, and then the more sense of wonder kind of magic, like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, where we don't really know what he can do or how he can do it. And I kind of like to include elements of both, have that element of the weird and unknowable in a story. I think Patricia McKillop does that pretty well in some of her stories. It kind of ties into the sort of spell that the monster in the story has put on the town, where she's kind of manipulating everybody's dreams and souls at some kind of unknowable, spooky level.
Yeah. Well, explain to us some of the first monster that Teresa encounters is called is it Sturga or Stiga?
I think it's Striga, but I'm not 100% of the pronunciation.
Where'd that come from, and what can that thing do, and how can you fight it?
Well, it depends on what folktale you're in. It's definitely not something I made up. Strigoi or Strigas are creatures from Slavic folklore in Eastern Europe, and I think Slavic folklore has a lot of really interesting, unusual monsters. And I wanted to use unusual monsters because I think we see vampires and werewolves and those kinds of creatures a lot, and I think sometimes they lose their sense of dread because they're familiar. We know how to kill a werewolf. You need silver. We know how to kill a vampire. You need sunlight or you need a stake. And the unfamiliar is spookier because we don't really know the rules straight away. Like in horror movies, I always found the scariest part to be near the beginning when we don't really know what kind of haunting or monster we're dealing with yet. So I chose like the folklore of Eastern Europe, which feels familiar on the one hand because it's part of Europe, and the European tradition is close to us in America as well. But it's also kind of exotic because we don't encounter Eastern Europe folklore and myth very much in media. And there's a vila in the story as well, which is another Eastern European kind of fey creature. I kind of put my own spin on that one a little bit, but I'm not the first person to use one. I think one shows up in Harry Potter somewhere, if I'm remembering correctly.
The fun thing about this is an example of your humor in the story as well, is that when she confronts her first monster, which is a vignette at the beginning of the story, he's a tailor by day and a monster by night, and she's actually
and a monster has to make a living, right?
Yeah, exactly. And she's paid him to make a dress for her, right? That's how she's gotten in. So there's some things that Teresa's able to do that perhaps not every monster hunter can in this world. The evocative style and the evocative imagery and the Serbic style just really were the things that set it above the other entries in this year's contest, I thought.
If you like a good action scene, if you like kind of a spooky monster story coupled with adventure and investigation and some good emotional resonance with the main character and her family in this town, I think that it kind of draws from a few different currents of fantasy. And
so tell us about winning the contest and going to Gencon. Were you there?
Yeah, I did go to Gencon, courtesy of Baen Books, so thank you for that. It was really great, a little exhausting, but great. It was the 50th year anniversary for Gencon, after being founded by basically Gary Gygax in his garage before he'd even invented Dungeons and Dragons. And this was the first year they've ever sold out. So it's just this enormous mass of people everywhere at Gencon. I think 65,000 tickets got sold, and there's maybe 800,000 people in Indianapolis. So that's a pretty big swarm of people coming in. It kind of felt like, nerd mecca or something, just tons of people coming into town for this big event. All the big board game and role-playing game manufacturers are there, card games, all kinds of demos, tournaments, and convention-exclusive stuff. It's a little bit like Comic-Con, but instead of Hollywood, it's kind of this games and literature continuum instead. Gencon has this whole separate track of programming featuring panels by professional writers like every hour of every day, like 4 or 5 going on at once. So there's a ton of stuff to choose from there if you're interested in sci-fi, fantasy, fiction. And really big names showed up this year. We had Charlene Harris, Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss, Margaret Weiss, and Tracy Hickman, and a lot more. For an aspiring writer, if you're thinking of going to Gencon, I definitely recommend checking out the symposium panels, because it's a great way to get advice from professionals. There's definitely a focus in a lot of the panels on providing, practical notes for new and upcoming writers. And it was at one of those panels where I was honored to receive the Baen Fantasy Adventure Award, the Baen Traveling Roadshow. Your fellow editor Jim Minns was there to MC, and Larry Correa was there to give out the award, and Eric Flinch and a few other authors showed up as well to talk about their upcoming releases over the next couple of years. And the audience got free books, free giveaways. It was a really great time, and I was really happy I was able to go.
Yeah, that's cool. Larry was there. Not your fellow Monster Hunter subject matter writer.
Yeah, I'd actually never read a Larry Correa story until I learned that he was going to be giving out the award, and I thought, well, I got to get familiar with him before I show up, and I picked up Son of the Black Sword, which is his fantasy adventure action epic kind of set in an alternative India. And he too has the magic sword, which decides whether or not it will agree to be used by the wielder, and is the only thing that can easily slay monsters in his world. So I thought, okay, Larry and I are kind of on the same wavelength here a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's a good wavelength to be on, especially among Baen readers. Killing monsters, we like that. So,
Oh yeah.
well, excellent. What are you working on at the moment? Any books in the works?
I do have 2 books that I'm working on, which one's kind of like a lighthearted middle grade fantasy novel, and the other's a more serious adult fantasy. I can't say for certain when they'll be done, but I hope soon. But in the meantime, if you want to find my work, I'd recommend not only reading the Baen Award winner when it comes out on the 15th of September, but also check out the August issue of Orson Scott Card's IGMS, where I appear as well.
Sure. You don't have a website. I didn't find one when I was trying to.
Oh, not yet. Maybe I need to get around to doing that.
Right.
I'm still new to this game, so the website is something I should start thinking about.
I don't know. I think it's a waste of time myself, but lots of writers have them. So it depends on what kind of how outgoing you are and such, and how it's somewhat useful.
The one thing I'm reluctant to do is to get onto Twitter. I was always a heel dragger on social media. But these days it's a great way for a lot of authors to connect with their fans. But I do think there is a risk sometimes. You see a few people get more interested in getting into the discussions online than they are.
Yeah, you got to be real careful as a writer not to create a medium that takes you away from your main work. Some writers are really good at balancing both, like Larry. Larry Correa is excellent at it, but it's
mine is a YA author, and they made a rule that they were only going to check social media for X hours every day, otherwise they could just get swept up in it.
Yeah, it'll eat your life and produce very little, and it will produce nothing that anyone will pay for. so just promote as much as possible, but really, just do the writing. Just a little advice. But the story is The Blue Widow by J.P. Sullivan. It will be on the Baen.com website for free in September, and it'll be available in perpetuity at Baen eBooks, where it will become part of the Free Stories 2017 collection. And it'll stay up at its link as well online. So you can find it all over the place, and look for J.P. Sullivan's name elsewhere in other magazines, because we really feel like he's an up-and-coming talent, and we're very happy to have him as the 2017 Baen Fantasy Adventure Award winner. So, John, thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you. My pleasure to be here, and thank you for those kind words.
This is another entry in Alliance of Equals, a Liaden Universe novel by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Beset by the angry remnants of the Department of the Interior, and challenged at every turn by opportunists on their new homeworld of Surebleak, and low on funds, Clan Corval desperately needs to reestablish its position as one of the top trading clans in known space. To this end, Master Trader Shaun Yoskalen and Corval's premier trade ship Dutiful Passage is on a mission to establish new business associations and to build a strong primary route that links well with existing loops and secondary routes. But reestablishing trade and preserving the lives of the few remaining members of the clan aren't all of Corval's problem. Matters come to a head as Dutiful Passage, accustomed to being welcomed and feted at those ports on its call list, finds itself denied docking and blacklisting, while agents of the DOI mount armed attacks on others of Corval's traders under the very eyes of port security systems. Traveling with Dutiful Trader on this unsettling journey is Paddy Yoskalen, the master trader's heir and his apprentice. Paddy is eager to make up for time lost due to Corval's unpleasantness with the Department of the Interior, but she is also keeping a secret so intense that her coming of age and perhaps her very life is threatened by it. And here is the latest entry in Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Alliance of Equals.
Paddy's knees were shaking, and her hair was damp with sweat. But she had managed the deal and gotten what she wanted at a price that was very nearly what she had intended to pay. Gustav Rell Anna had produced a sample of what was in his storerooms, along with certifications from the growers and harvesters. She had scanned them with the reader provided by the port and found them authentic, which was to say, the port transmitted to her the Laster Cooperative's confirmation that the information she had been given was true and correct. The samples tasted good to her. The nut meat was firm and a little sweet, very pleasant in the mouth. But she was certainly not an expert on freshness. The certifications from the growers' co-op included a list of nutrients and a graph showing the rate at which each degraded in stasis and on the shelf. Gustav Rell Anna wanted more per unit than Paddy's limit, but again, her research stood her well. She didn't quite have to walk away from the counter before her view prevailed, though it had been a near thing. And in the end, he had gotten a little of his own back. Because of the method by which the nuts were packed and sold, she was required to overbuy, for he would not break a sealed unit. She signed the sales chit, gave him the code for the tug which would be bringing the Passage's pod into orbit, and the deal was done. "It has been a pleasure, Trader Josgallen," the vendor told her, shouting again. "Come to me whenever you have need of my Laster. I will be very glad to do business with you again." That made her a little uneasy. But the papers had been signed, the delivery scheduled, and the money, she was certain, already transferred out of the port account with her name on it. Master Trader Josgallen would surely critique her performance on the shuttle lift to the passage, and she would learn then if she had been foolish beyond measure. She exchanged bows with the vendor and found her way out of the booth, Mr. Higgs falling in beside her, father, still rather indistinct, beside him. Gods, she wanted a cup of tea and a quiet place to sit and gather her composure. That was not her usual reaction to a completed trade. Most usually, she felt exhilarated and curious to see what else the market might offer. Today, she only wanted to leave. However, she was not alone. Indeed, she was in the company of a master trader who had not necessarily shared all of his requirements with her. "Is there business yet to do?" she asked. There was a slight pause, as if Mr. Higgs waited for the master trader to speak. When there was no contribution from that quarter, he said that he had no other business and that they were coming up on time for the shuttle anyway. Paddy nodded and led the way toward the slideway, her stride somewhat less energetic than it had been on the way in. She wondered if Gustav Rell Anna had a Nurly-gig or another, less legal mood regulator concealed inside his booth. The slideway platform was just ahead. She forced herself to walk more quickly. Shaun felt something settle in the depths of his pocket and sighed. It was nice while it lasted, he thought, watching Paddy ahead of them. The child looked exhausted, which was likely those short sleep shifts catching up with her at the far end of an unexpectedly vigorous session of trade. He had been wary of broaching the topic of sleep shifts. As a mere father, his concern would surely be set aside for her own necessities, and he was loath to bring the master trader into the matter. Well, they would have a conference on the lift to the passage. He would mention it then in the context of the effectiveness of the trader on the floor. That might set her to thinking. He put his hand into his pocket and pulled out the red counter. It was glowing somewhat, and he felt as plain as a kiss on his cheek. Priscilla's love, warm and steady. Closing his fingers around the token, he smiled to himself. At least now he knew where it had gone. Best if it had returned to Weapons Hall and the improbable addition of himself he had met there, Lute the magician. Failing that, it was good that it took itself off to Priscilla, who had the skill to deal with it, rather than landing in the pocket of some random trader or dealer in antiquities. Ahead, Paddy was angling toward the ramp that led to the slideway platform. Several people were clustered near a booth there, and one of those turned his head, spotted Paddy, and detached himself, his course set to intercept. Shaun took a deep breath, thrusting the counter back into his pocket, and deliberately thought himself very visible indeed. Paddy saw him out of the corner of her eye, a male in local clothing, perhaps a little older than she was. His height and his features combined to convince her that he was Liaden. He was coming toward her, deliberately, as if he knew her. She had never seen him before, she was certain of it. Liadens were no longer safe, and the agents of the Department of the Interior were demonstrably stupid enough to walk up to them openly and demand that she and Father and Mr. Higgs come with them. If he didn't try anything stupider. Still, she thought, recalling to mind her lessons in Debriat and Arms Master Schneider's advice, still, it might be something else. He might be on another trajectory altogether, and not on course for them. She altered her course somewhat. The boy altered his course, still aiming to cut her off. Paddy took a breath, taking in the surroundings with a quick glance. Open enough, some people, but not a crowd, and he seemed to be by himself. She stopped, centered, and faced him. He smiled, wide and delighted, not Liaden, and came forward more rapidly. She flexed her knees. Though he wouldn't be much to throw, she was briefly grateful that she had given Father her bowl. "Well, what's this, an acquaintance late met?" Father's voice was loud in her ear, and there he was, completely solid and abruptly between her and the approaching target, her bowl in its sack over his shoulder. "Paddy, do you know this young person?" The boy stopped, confusion on his face. Perhaps, Paddy thought, he was wondering where Father had come from. "No, sir," she said, in answer to his question. "We have not met." "Ah, but perhaps it was myself you wished to speak with?" Father asked. The boy shook his head. "Your pardon, sir. It was the lady. I thought I did know her, the resemblance, but I see that I'm wrong. Pardon, sirs. Lady." He bowed, a shapeless thing, neither Liaden nor Terran, and without waiting for an acknowledgement, turned back the way he had come. Paddy let out a long, shaking breath. "Well now," Father said, looking down at her from his height. His voice was mocking, but his eyes were not. Wasn't that easier than killing the poor lad? She hadn't been going to kill him, Paddy thought. Unless he had proven a threat, of course. "I didn't know him," she said, her voice sounding angry in her own ears. "If he was a threat, I wanted to be prepared." "Exactly correct," Father said. "And now that he has been properly chastised, I suggest we board the slideway and go home." Chapter 8. Chessel's World. Paddy settled into a hard plastic chair in the cellars section of the Chesilport Grand Auction Hall. There was no real reason for her to be in the hall. All of the important transactions, saving the sale, of course, had been handled at the auctioneer's docket in the antechamber. There, she had registered her cargo, provided a unit sample, her receipt, and the certifications and verifications from Andiri Port and the Laster Cooperative. The cargo had previously been moved to the bidding bin assigned to the passage, along with the goods Master Trader Yosgallen had on offer. Tame stuff there. The number 3 mix, none of the goods he had taken on at Andiri, nothing at all interesting, really. Number 3 mix was the blandest of the 6 standard trade mixes the Master Trader had to hand. In Paddy's opinion. Of course, she thought, looking up at the upcoming auctions board, he probably wanted to learn something from his offering. How many bid and at what price? Who had bid? If they accepted or rejected the trade catalog offered free to all who asked? How many actually made contact with him after accepting the catalog? And if they had anything potentially interesting or only useful to offer the habitants of an upcoming port? He, of course, wasn't here to watch the auction. Master traders had far more lucrative matters to tend. The auction was an introduction. That was all. A way, one way, to get his name out on the port and into the mouths of the street vendors. He himself had been invited to a reception at the portmaster's office later in the local day, and was currently contacting prominent names on port to arrange for meetings before and after. Paddy sighed where she sat, her eyes on the board. One vendor had bid on her offering at the usual market rate. She twisted her fingers together and reminded herself that this was only one bid, and likely an automatic as it had come so quickly. The bidder hadn't had a chance to read the documentation, really, and to understand why what she had on offer had value. She sighed. The reception. Ordinarily, she would have been at the reception too, as the master trader's apprentice, but the invitation had specified Master Trader Yosgallen and no guests. It seemed an odd thing, and she had said so. Father had merely said that he had seen odder, and told her that she would, therefore, need to see to the auction of her cargo without his help. Which was a joke, naturally enough, and the reason why Paddy came to be able to indulge herself at the public auction, with only third mate and pilot Dilnem Tiazen and comtech Sally Trilloff at her side. The third mate was kin, of course. Corval and Arab allowed such relationships, so often had the lines been crossed, though very much her elder. He had, in fact, come out of retirement to oblige the captain when she sought to fill those posts left vacant by the events on Liad. Despite his age, his hair was quite red. He was stern and had little to say for himself. He had voiced no objection to Paddy's scheme of sitting for a while to watch the bidding. Merely, he had settled into a chair near, though not next to her, pulled a reader out of his pocket, and was immediately immersed in a book or a report or... Sally was another matter. Paddy felt that Sally would rather have liked to walk about the port, instead of sitting in an auditorium watching the apprentice trader stare at the bid boards and bite her fingernails. She really ought to suggest that they wander to Sally's whim. After all, the auctioneer had her comm code and would transmit the details when, if, the lot sold. The auctioneer also had her account information on file. Her portion of the sale, less the auctioneer's percentage and such taxes as the port levied, would be automatically forwarded to it. There really was no reason to sit here and monitor the board herself, as if her attention might influence the outcome. She leaned toward Sally, her eyes still on the board, and abruptly straightened. Breath caught. Another bid had come in, appreciably higher than the first, a bid more in line with the worth of the product described in the documentation she had provided the auctioneer. Paddy forced herself to breathe, swallowed, and a third bid came in, this one even more substantial than the second. Paddy's chest hurt. It was going according to plan. Her mylaster would be known as a superior product, and she would be paid. Her research had suggested that she would net between 2 and 3% more than the degraded mylaster that came to Chessel's world via the loop ships. The profit was good, of course, but the real prize would be if she could parlay today's sale into a standing order. If she could turn that trump, why, she would have had a hand in shaping the route itself, and would win for Chessel's world the honor of a scheduled stop. She stared up at the board, her hands clenched on her lap, blinking as a fourth bid came in, slightly higher than the bid before, which might mean that momentum was slowing, but it couldn't have topped out already. Paddy, a light hand pressed her sleeve. "You okay?" Paddy felt a jolt of guilt. Sally. She had been going to offer Sally the lead, which was only balanced and fair. She turned and smiled deliberately into the tech's dark eyes. "It is my first large offer at auction," she said, and saw a tiny expression of disappointment cross the woman's face. "But," Paddy continued, "I can follow the bidding on my comm." She pulled the unit from her belt. "I will make certain of my channel, and then let us go out onto the port. If you will lead us?" Sally smiled widely, pleased. "Good. I'd really like that," she said, and her smile faded slightly. She turned to look at Dil Nem. "Sir, do you wish to lead on port?" It was a courtesy for his rank, Paddy knew, and it spoke well of Sally that she offered it when she plainly wished the position herself. The third mate looked up from his reader and lifted a shoulder. "I have no need to lead," he said, in strongly accented but perfectly intelligible Terran. "Please, find for us the hidden delights of the port." Sally took that as a challenge. Paddy saw it in the flash of her eyes. "I'll be happy to do so, sir," she said, and looked to Paddy. "Have you found your channel?" "I have," she said. "I may be heard to ping every now and then as new bids come in." "Fair warning," Sally said. She stood, a grin on her face, and nodded toward the closest exit. "There's our way out." Chessel Port was open to the weather, which was agreeable. Her research had revealed that Chessel's world at this latitude and longitude enjoyed clement weather, with no great variation in temperatures and no extended rainy season. Other geographies on world did labor under these inconveniences, but they did not intrude upon the port. Following Sally down broad streets lined with shops, Paddy was reminded of the days when she had accompanied father up and down Sol Sintra Port as he pursued his duties there. The comm on her belt pinged as they walked, but she resisted the temptation to look at the screen every time. Every other time, that was well enough. It was a good compromise between a trader's care for the trade and a proper enthusiasm for a crewmate's skills. For Sally was a skilled leader. Unlike some other crewmates, whom Paddy charitably did not name even to herself, Sally had a sure instinct for interesting streets and a good eye for a shop likely to hold unusual wares. Paddy was particularly impressed by a shop hosting a live demonstration of what she gathered was a traditional dyeing technique. It would seem that Dilnem and Sally were similarly struck, for neither protested Paddy's suggestion that they stay to watch a second demonstration. The dyer noticed their interest and rewarded it by draping a finished scarf in graduating shades of green around Dilnem's neck with a smile. "It becomes 'ee," he said. "Wear it in health." For a moment, it seemed to Paddy as if Dilnem might refuse the gift. Then he bowed smoothly. "I thank you," he said, and Paddy, just behind him, added, "Have you a card? If anyone asks my kinsman where he came by such a handsome scarf, we want to give good directions." The man grinned. He produced a card from the pocket of his apron with a flourish and handed it to Paddy. "There's a smart kitlet," he said. "For that, your own scarf, and your friend, too." He was as good as his word. Sally's scarf was a deep crimson with pale pink borders, and Paddy's sported a swirling pattern of misty violet and deep purple. After leaving the dye shop, Paddy's comm pinged 3 times on a rising tone. She snatched it off her belt and thumbed on the screen. She stopped, staring. "Bad news?" Sally asked from beside her. "No," she said slowly. "I don't think so. My lot sold at 3.5% over average. A good price. But I am wanted by the auctioneer to sign an affidavit." The traders of Chesilport were a standoffish lot, Shaun thought, leaning back in his chair with a frown. Working with the port directory and trade bios, he had created a list of traders to contact from most desirable to least and had spent the last hour and a half calling them in order. He had not expected to complete the list before it was time to depart for the portmaster's reception, but he had expected that he would have at least 6 appointments to keep afterward. As it happened, he was disappointed in both of his expectations, for he had called every name on the list and still lacked 3/4 of an hour to his departure time. And he had not one appointment to show for his labors. True, he had only managed to speak to a handful of traders personally, but every one of them had been busy or had nothing to offer at this time. To the latter, he had said that it was an introductory visit only, whereupon they, too, were busy. It was unprecedented. Staring up at the ceiling, arms folded behind his head, Shaun tried to recall if he had ever in his life found a port where no one cared to speak to him. Even on Dayan, so long as he remained in the port proper and in the company of a woman, he found traders willing to talk with him. Not necessarily to trade with him, he having made the genetic error of being male, but to show wares in case he happened to know of a ship properly captained by a woman, where the trader was also a woman of a clan whose delm was a woman. Really, it was quite lowering. He was beginning to enter into Theo's feelings of rejection. Perhaps he had erred in the matter of the auction. He had wished to feel out the market, as, one had assumed, the market had wished to feel out a new trader come to port. Lot number 3, commonplace as it was, generally produced good results in that regard. The simplicity of the offerings very often served to soothe those who might be wary of that new trader on port, thinking that he might be too dear, or one of those fellows who dandled in exotic wares and would scarcely admit that there might ever be the possibility of a market for hairbrushes. He sighed at the ceiling and closed his eyes. Had he come up against local custom? Was he, in fact, precipitate? Ought he to have waited until the portmaster's reception? The Chesilport World Book had not mentioned an introduction protocol, but the books were sometimes blind in interesting ways. If it was so ingrained that one must be introduced to a stranger by a person of suitable status before one might interact with said stranger, it might very well go without saying. For what civilized person would behave differently? He snorted lightly. "Assume that you've sinned against custom, Shaun," he said aloud. "Go to the portmaster's gather, become introduced, and hope that the traders you contacted out of order are of a uniformly forgiving—" A gong sounded loudly. Shaun spun the chair, his hand flashing out to the keyboard, alert, incoming, that ugly noise meant. Something bad had happened. "No, I will not sign that." Paddy looked directly into the auctioneer's eyes. "I did not enter stolen goods into the auction, and I do not agree to forfeit my profit. I showed you the receipts and the certifications. You accepted them and placed them in the bid packet with the rest of the information." She paused and deliberately lifted an eyebrow. "Did you not?" That was, perhaps, a bit too much, from apprentice trader to an auctioneer, but she was angry, and she was certainly not going to sign this affidavit admitting a crime she did not commit, nor was she going to allow them to keep the proceeds of her sale, the considerable proceeds of her sale. "The receipts and certifications are legitimate," the auctioneer said. "I regret that we accepted them before we were informed that the lot is part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. I advise you that signing the affidavit and forfeiting the funds is your best option." "I will do no such thing. I am connected with a registered and well-respected trade ship, the Dutiful Passage herself. Show me this ongoing criminal enterprise." "The burden of proof is not on me," the auctioneer said. "Relinquish my profits," Paddy said, proud of how stern and steady her voice was. "I will not sign the affidavit. You may take it away." "Trader, I cannot. The law is clear. Profits from a criminal enterprise are forfeit to the port. Those who do not sign the affidavit reveal themselves as criminals in fact and are taken up by security." She felt a presence by her left shoulder, heard low-voiced Liaden in her ear. "Trader, perhaps it is best to sign." "No," she said sharply, to Dilnem and the auctioneer alike. "I shall not sign. What I will do, however, is file a report with TerraTrade. This is theft." "Very good, trader," Dilnem said in loud Terran. "Let us return to the ship." He took her arm. She thought about resisting him, but what more could she do here? The auctioneer was adamant. There seemed little hope of recovering what was hers, short of holding him at gunpoint, and perhaps not even then. The pressure on her arm increased. She relaxed deliberately and allowed Dilnem to turn. A simple pivot, very smoothly done, and the three of them exited the hall. No one stepped forward to prevent it. "The shuttle," Dilnem said, once they were outside. "Quickly. Comtech, please call ahead. Inform the pilot that we will require immediate entry." "Yes, third mate," Sally said, and in a moment Paddy heard her on the comm, crisply relaying the third mate's orders. Paddy's knees were shaking, and she could scarcely think for the anger burning in her breast. Her plan had merit. She had sold her cargo at a fine profit, which the auctioneer refused to pay out, and it wasn't fair. It was theft, and she would not. "Best to bring it before the master trader," Dilnem murmured, and more loudly, "Comtech, please ask the pilot to contact Captain Mendoza and Master Trader Yosgallen. Say that the trader has lost her profit to port legalities. Say ongoing criminal enterprise." "Yes, third mate," Sally said again, and once more there was the sound of quiet consultation behind Paddy's back. "You may," Paddy said, "release me, third mate." He cast a measuring look at her. She met his eyes firmly, and after a moment he released her arm. At the same time, however, he increased his pace, not running, never running. A person running on port only inspired others to run after her. He was, however, walking very briskly, and therefore several steps ahead of their small group when they came round the corner and onto the street that led to the shipyard. "Halt!" 3 large persons dressed in the livery of Chesilport security stood before them, 2 with weapons leveled. Dilnem halted and threw out an arm to stop Paddy. She, in turn, looked over her shoulder for Sally, who was looking over her shoulder at 3 more uniformed persons behind them, each also holding a weapon. "Master Trader, a message from Comtech Sally Trilloff, on port with third mate Tiazen and Trader Yosgallen, forwarded by the shuttle pilot on world." A chilly breeze blew across the back of Shaun's neck. He took a deep, quiet breath. "Please proceed, Comtech." "Yes, sir. Message follows. Trader Yosgallen has lost her profit to port legalities. The auctioneer wanted her to sign an affidavit, which she refused to do. Reason given for confiscation: involvement in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Roner Jerathine, that was the tech's name. An unflappable individual, in Shaun's experience, this moment sounding just a bit breathless. "Continues," the tech said. "The 3 have been placed under arrest by armed Chesilport security and are being escorted to the magistrate's office, where they will be incarcerated, fined, or both." The pilot heard, through the open comm, a man's voice state in trade that those found to be complicit in crimes against a planet have in the past been executed. There was a small pause, as if Comtech Jerathine was swallowing his horror, as Shaun was swallowing his then. "At this juncture, the pilot says the comm was taken away from Tech Trilloff. He heard her protesting and demanding that it be returned. There was a very loud noise, and the unit went dead." But this was ridiculous, Shaun thought. Crimes against a planet meant piracy and aggression. And while some worlds did indeed hang convicted pirates, the charge itself was ludicrous. Dutiful Passage was an honorable and well-known trade ship. He closed his eyes. Dutiful Passage had stood above Liad. weapons live, backing an action that had seen Terran mercenaries on the ground at the spaceport, that left a gaping hole in its largest city, an action that had killed people, innocent people, who had simply been going about their lives. Crimes against a planet, indeed. Same message relayed to Captain Mendoza, sir, Tech Jerathine said. She's talking to Chesilport Magistrate Office now. Thank you, Rona, he said, as calmly as if Paddy was on board and at Debriat, beyond all possible threats against her life. Please ask the captain to call me when she's done with the magistrate. Will do. Shaun thought he heard a note of sympathy in the man's voice. Anything else for me, sir? Not at the moment. I thank you. Right then. A deep breath. Jerathine out.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com, to Christopher Rocchio, and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz.
And the remains of the day mixed up in a shimmering vat of unicorn sweat and fairy dust bunnies and blasted into a red sky at morning, sailor take warning, to celebrate the Baen Fantasy Adventure Award winner, The Blue Widow by J.P. Sullivan.
Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.